At 11:30 on a November night, JFK Airport hummed with the quiet efficiency of late arrivals and departures. Marcus Williams sat in his taxi, half listening to the radio announce Sterling Aviation's latest billion-dollar contract, when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A 5-year-old boy stood alone near baggage claim, crying in rapid French while clutching a small toy airplane, his designer clothes marking him as clearly out of place in the working-class taxi queue. Marcus recognized that face immediately from countless newspaper photos. Lucas Sterling, son of Victoria Sterling, the woman who had destroyed his engineering career and indirectly caused his wife's death 2 years ago. The airport PA crackled to life. "We are searching for missing child Lucas Sterling." Marcus gripped his steering wheel, his hands trembling as images of his late wife Sarah and that devastating termination letter flashed through his mind. Some moments don't allow you time to think, and this was definitely one of them. Marcus Williams had once been the kind of man who solved problems for a living. As a senior aerospace engineer at Sterling Aviation, he had spent his days designing safety systems that could save hundreds of lives with a single innovation. His worn leather briefcase had carried blueprints that could revolutionize commercial aviation, and his colleagues had respected the quiet intensity with which he approached each project. Now, at 35, he drove a yellow cab through the same airport where business executives flew off to meetings he would never attend again. His son Tommy, now 6 years old, still believed his father was temporarily between engineering jobs, asking every few weeks when Daddy would go back to building airplanes. Marcus had never found the heart to tell the boy that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. The termination had come on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered with corporate efficiency that masked its devastating personal impact. Victoria Sterling had personally delivered his termination notice, citing budget cuts and restructuring, her tailored navy suit and measured tone making the conversation feel like a business transaction rather than the destruction of a man's livelihood. What she hadn't mentioned was that his innovative safety proposals had been too expensive to implement, too revolutionary for a company focused on quarterly profits rather than long-term vision. His designs gathered dust in filing cabinets while cheaper alternatives were approved. Compromises that made Marcus's stomach turn every time he heard about aircraft incidents that his systems might have prevented. Sarah, his wife, had taken the financial pressure harder than he had anticipated. She had always been delicate, prone to anxiety that she managed with medication and Marcus's steady presence, but the mounting bills created a perfect storm of stress that overwhelmed her coping mechanisms. The mounting bills, the rejection letters from other aerospace companies, the whispered conversations among neighbors about their foreclosure notice. All of it had pressed down on her like a physical weight. She had stopped sleeping through the night, stopped eating regular meals, stopped believing that their situation was temporary. Marcus had worked double shifts driving the taxi, but it wasn't enough to cover the mortgage payments on their suburban home, the medical bills, and Tommy's childcare expenses. He remembered finding her note on a cold February morning, neatly folded beside the coffee maker they could no longer afford to run. The handwriting was steady despite the devastating content, characteristic of Sarah's careful nature even in her darkest moment. "I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough for this fight," she had written in her precise script. "Take care of Tommy. Give him the life I couldn't help you provide. You deserve better than watching me fall apart piece by piece." Marcus had read those words 1,000 times, and each reading cut deeper than the last, revealing new layers of pain he hadn't noticed before. Victoria Sterling had sent flowers to the funeral. Expensive ones, arranged in an elaborate display that dwarfed the modest arrangements from neighbors and friends. But she hadn't come in person. Marcus had thrown the condolence card away without reading it, unable to bear the thought of corporate sympathy from the woman who had set their tragedy in motion. Now, watching Lucas Sterling cry alone in an airport terminal, Marcus felt the universe presenting him with the cruelest of ironies. This child needed help, and the rational part of Marcus's mind whispered that he should simply call airport security and drive away, let someone else deal with the mess, while he returned to his scheduled route. But as he watched Lucas stumble and nearly fall, still clutching that toy airplane with desperate determination, his small shoulders shaking with exhaustion and fear, Marcus found himself switching off his taxi's engine. Some instincts run deeper than revenge, and tonight, his instincts as a father overruled everything else. The boy's vulnerability reminded him painfully of Tommy during those terrible weeks after Sarah's death, when his own son had cried for his mother with the same heartbroken confusion now written across Lucas's face. Marcus approached slowly, crouching down to the boy's eye level with the careful movements of someone accustomed to dealing with frightened children. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly, his voice gentle, despite the turmoil in his chest. "Are you lost?" Lucas nodded vigorously, switching between English and French as he explained that his mother was supposed to meet him but never came, that the nice lady on the airplane had walked him to baggage claim but then disappeared. The boy's English was remarkably good for his age, though heavily accented, and Marcus realized he was probably more scared than confused. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Lucas Sterling," the boy replied, wiping his nose on his sleeve with unconscious trust. "My mama has big airplanes. She builds them like in my toy." Lucas held up his toy plane, and Marcus's breath caught in his throat as recognition hit him like a physical blow. It was a perfect replica of the safety-enhanced aircraft design he had submitted to Sterling Aviation 3 years ago. The design that had been rejected as too costly to implement, now reduced to a child's plaything. The drive to Marcus's apartment took 25 minutes through Queens traffic, and during that time, Marcus learned more about Lucas Sterling than he had ever expected to know. The boy spoke 4 languages, but had never been to a normal school, educated instead by private tutors who came to his family's estate. He could identify aircraft by their engine sounds, but had never ridden on a city bus, had never been to a grocery store without security guards, had never played with children his own age except at carefully supervised playdates. Lucas's questions about the taxi, why the seats were different colors, why there were numbers on the outside, why Marcus knew all the street names, revealed a sheltered existence that made Marcus feel unexpectedly protective. By the time they reached Marcus's building, Lucas had fallen asleep in the back seat, still clutching his airplane, his face peaceful in the way that only exhausted children can manage. Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman who watched Tommy during Marcus's night shifts, simply said, "The boy is alone. Of course you bring him here," when Marcus explained the situation in hurried Spanish. She had been their neighbor for 3 years, had helped with Tommy during the worst days after Sarah's death, and had never questioned Marcus's decisions about caring for his son. Her apartment smelled of cooking spices and old photographs, and she kept emergency supplies for Tommy in case Marcus's shifts ran late. She took one look at Lucas and immediately began preparing a bed on her sofa, muttering in Spanish about rich people who couldn't keep track of their children. Tommy woke up when Marcus was settling Lucas on the living room couch, and his excitement at having another child in the apartment was immediate and infectious. "Is he going to be my friend?" Tommy asked in his loud whisper, the same question he asked whenever they encountered other children at the playground or grocery store. Tommy's social opportunities were limited by their circumstances, and Marcus felt a familiar pang of guilt about the isolation his son experienced. The boys bonded over breakfast, with the speed that only children can manage, comparing airplane facts and building cereal box towers while Marcus watched from the kitchen, coffee growing cold in his hands. Lucas knew technical details about aircraft engines that impressed even Marcus, while Tommy shared his collection of toy cars and explained the rules of his invented racing games. Marcus watched them together and felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. This wasn't the spoiled rich kid he had expected. This was simply a little boy who happened to have been born into circumstances beyond his control. Lucas said please and thank you automatically, helped Tommy clean up without being asked, and showed genuine interest in Tommy's simple toys despite probably having access to much more expensive entertainment. The contrast between the boy's expensive clothes and his obvious loneliness struck Marcus as profoundly sad, a reminder that money couldn't solve every problem. The phone call came at 9:15 in the morning, interrupting the boy's elaborate game involving action figures and cardboard boxes. The number on his caller ID made his stomach drop. Sterling Aviation Headquarters, a number he hadn't seen in 2 years but still recognized immediately. "Marcus Williams speaking," he answered, his voice carefully neutral despite the way his hands had started shaking. There was a pause, the sound of someone taking a deep breath, and then Victoria Sterling's voice said, "Mr. Williams, this is Victoria Sterling. I believe you have my son." Her tone was controlled, professional, but Marcus could hear the underlying current of panic, the careful restraint of someone who had been awake all night making phone calls and coordinating search efforts. "Yes," Marcus said simply, offering no additional information, no reassurance, no explanation. "Is safe," he added after a moment, because despite everything, he wasn't cruel enough to let a mother worry unnecessarily. Another pause, longer this time, filled with the weight of their shared history. "I'm coming to get him," she said finally. And Marcus heard the sound of car keys, the urgency of someone already moving toward the door. Victoria Sterling arrived exactly 18 minutes later, which meant she had driven significantly faster than legal speed limits allowed. Marcus recognized her immediately, despite the casual jeans and sweater that replaced her usual business attire. Despite the lack of makeup and the way her hair fell loose around her shoulders instead of being pulled back in its characteristic professional style. She looked younger than in corporate photographs, more vulnerable and far more frightened than he had ever seen her. She stood in his doorway for a moment, taking in the modest apartment with its mismatched furniture and children's toys scattered across the living room, her eyes scanning for signs of her son. "Lucas," she called softly, her voice breaking slightly on his name. And the boy looked up from where he was showing Tommy how to fold paper airplanes, with instant recognition and genuine joy. He ran to her immediately, his small arms wrapping around her legs, and she knelt down to embrace him with an intensity that spoke of real love rather than mere relief. "Thank you," Victoria said to Marcus, straightening up while keeping one hand protectively on Lucas's shoulder, her other hand smoothing his hair with unconscious maternal gestures. "I can't tell you how grateful I am. When security called to say he was missing from the arrival gate, I thought—" She stopped herself, apparently unwilling to voice her worst fears in front of the children. Marcus nodded, but didn't respond immediately, studying her face for signs of the cold corporate executive who had destroyed his life. Instead, he saw a woman who looked like she hadn't slept all night, whose expensive clothes couldn't hide the fact that she had been genuinely terrified about her child's safety. Lucas was chattering excitedly about Tommy and airplane models and the cereal box towers they had built, oblivious to the tension between the two adults, his rapid-fire storytelling punctuated by gestures and sound effects. The conversation they needed to have hung in the air between them, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Marcus could feel the weight of unresolved anger and grief pressing against his chest, while Victoria's eyes kept darting between her son and Marcus's face, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Lucas solved the immediate problem by asking innocently, "Mama, can Tommy come to our house sometime? Marcus said he builds real airplanes like you do, and Tommy has never seen a swimming pool." Victoria's face went pale, and Marcus saw the exact moment when she realized that Lucas had been talking about airplanes with someone who actually understood aircraft design, someone whose name might be familiar for reasons she was only beginning to remember. "Maybe we should talk," Victoria said quietly, her voice barely audible above the children's continuing chatter. They stepped onto the small balcony attached to his living room, the November air cold enough to make their breath visible. Victoria closed the sliding door behind them and turned to face Marcus directly, her hands shoved deep into her coat pockets. "I remember you," she said without preamble, her voice steady despite the obvious discomfort of the situation. "I remember everything about that day. The termination meeting, your proposals, the way you looked when I delivered the news." Marcus felt his jaw tighten involuntarily, muscle memory responding to the mention of that devastating conversation. "Do you?" he asked, his voice carrying 2 years of accumulated bitterness. "Because I remember believing that my work mattered, right up until the moment you told me it didn't. I remember thinking that someone who understood aviation safety would recognize innovation when they saw it." Victoria flinched as if he had struck her physically, her composed facade cracking slightly. "It wasn't personal," she said. But her voice lacked conviction, and they both knew the words were inadequate. The story came out in pieces, measured and controlled, despite the emotion behind each word. Marcus told her about the financial pressure, about Sarah's depression, about the mounting bills that had felt like walls closing in around their small family. He told her about finding Sarah's note and planning a funeral he couldn't afford, about explaining to a 4-year-old boy why his mother wasn't coming home anymore. He told her about the months of job rejections, about the way other aerospace companies had treated him like damaged goods, about the slow realization that his career in aviation was over. Victoria listened without interrupting, her face growing progressively paler as the full scope of the consequences became clear. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city skyline. "I didn't know," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "I swear to you, I didn't know about your wife." "Would it have mattered?" Marcus asked quietly, the question that had haunted him for 2 years finally spoken aloud. "If you had known, would it have changed your decision? Would you have kept me on, implemented my safety proposals, done anything differently?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her breath creating small clouds in the cold air. "I don't know," she admitted finally, her honesty surprising him. "I want to say yes, but I honestly don't know. I was different then. I thought business was just business, that personal consequences were separate from corporate decisions. I thought I could make purely rational choices without considering the human cost." Inside the apartment, they could hear Lucas and Tommy laughing about something, the sound of children playing together, and it seemed to highlight the absurdity of their situation. 2 adults with a painful history, brought together by chance and a lost child. "Your son is a good kid," Marcus said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "He was scared last night, but he was brave too. He didn't cry very long, and he helped Tommy with puzzles this morning." Victoria smiled for the first time since arriving, her face transforming with genuine warmth. "That airplane means everything to him," she said, gesturing toward the toy visible through the glass door. "His father gave it to him before he died. Lucas carries it everywhere, sleeps with it, talks to it when he's lonely." Marcus felt something shift in his chest at that information, a fundamental reframe of his understanding. Victoria Sterling was a widow too, navigating single parenthood just like he was, dealing with her own grief and loss while trying to run a billion-dollar company. The conversation was interrupted by Tommy calling through the glass door, his voice muffled but urgent. "Marcus, Lucas wants to know if you can fix his airplane. The wing is loose and it won't fly straight anymore." Marcus examined the toy aircraft Lucas held out hopefully, his engineer's eye automatically assessing the problem. The wing mechanism had worked loose from repeated play, and the connection point needed reinforcement. Using a small toolbox from his bedroom, he tightened the wing mechanism and reinforced the connection with thin wire, turning the repair into an impromptu lesson about aircraft structural integrity. Lucas watched with fascination as Marcus explained load distribution and stress points, his questions revealing an understanding of engineering principles that was remarkable for a 5-year-old. Victoria watched the entire process with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read, her eyes moving between her son's face and Marcus's hands as he worked. Before Marcus could process what was happening, his phone rang with the distinctive tone he had assigned to Tommy's school. The nurse explained that Tommy was in the office with asthma symptoms and needed to go home immediately, that his inhaler wasn't providing sufficient relief, and he was asking for his father. Marcus's chest tightened with familiar parental panic, the kind that made everything else seem unimportant. "I'll drive you," Victoria said immediately, apparently reading his expression. "My car is right outside and it's faster than calling a taxi." Lucas had already heard the word school and was bouncing excitedly at the prospect of seeing where Tommy learned to read and write, his enthusiasm infectious despite the circumstances. Marcus found himself nodding acceptance, grabbing Tommy's emergency medication and his own jacket. The drive to Tommy's school took 12 minutes in Victoria's luxury sedan, and Marcus tried not to notice the contrast between the leather seats and climate control and his own worn taxi. Lucas peppered him with questions about schools and teachers, having never experienced traditional education himself. When they arrived, Tommy was sitting in the nurse's office, looking pale and tired, his breathing slightly labored despite the medication. He brightened immediately when he saw Marcus, but his eyes widened with excitement when he spotted Lucas through the doorway. "You came to my school!" Tommy exclaimed, and Lucas nodded solemnly, as if visiting a friend's school was the most natural thing in the world. On the drive back to the apartment, Lucas asked Victoria if they could stop at a playground so he could show Tommy how to properly throw a paper airplane, a skill he had apparently learned from his private tutors. The playground was small and slightly run down, with equipment that had seen better days, but Lucas threw himself into exploring every piece with enthusiastic determination. He climbed the jungle gym with the fearless confidence of a child who had never been told that certain activities were too dangerous for someone of his social status. Victoria and Marcus sat on a bench, watching their sons play, the November suns providing just enough warmth to make the outing pleasant. "He's never played like this before," Victoria said quietly, her voice filled with something that might have been regret. "Not with this kind of freedom. Usually there are security concerns, or other parents who treat him differently because of who I am." As the afternoon progressed, Marcus found himself seeing Victoria in a completely different light. She wasn't the cold corporate executive he had built up in his imagination over the past 2 years. She was a woman trying to balance impossible demands, just like he was, making difficult choices with incomplete information and dealing with the consequences as best she could. She worried about her son's social development, asked genuine questions about public schools and neighborhood libraries, wondered aloud whether Lucas's isolated upbringing was preparing him for real life or protecting him from it. When Lucas fell and scraped his knee on the playground equipment, she cleaned the wound efficiently, but let Tommy be the one to offer comfort, recognizing that peer support meant more than parental reassurance in that moment. The boys played until the sun began to set, their game evolving from simple tag to an elaborate scenario involving space travel and rescue missions. Marcus watched them together and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of possibility, of life expanding beyond the narrow constraints of survival and grief. Victoria seemed to be experiencing something similar, her posture relaxing as the afternoon wore on, her laughter becoming more frequent and genuine. When it was time to leave, both boys protested vigorously, extracting promises of future playdates before reluctantly accepting the inevitable. After Victoria and Lucas drove away, Marcus lay awake that night thinking about the day's events. He had expected to feel angry about seeing Victoria again, had anticipated the satisfaction of having her in his debt, of being able to demonstrate his moral superiority through his care for her son. Instead, he felt confused and unsettled, his carefully constructed narrative of victimhood complicated by the reality of Victoria's humanity. She wasn't the monster he had imagined her to be. She was flawed, certainly, and had made decisions that had hurt him badly, but she was also a grieving widow, trying to raise her son alone, dealing with her own guilt and regret while attempting to run a company that employed thousands of people. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call from Victoria, her voice carefully professional despite the personal nature of their recent interactions. "I have a business proposition for you," she said, diving straight into the matter without preamble. "Sterling Aviation has been struggling with some design challenges on our new safety systems. We need fresh perspectives from someone who understands both innovation and practical implementation. I'd like to offer you a consulting contract." She outlined a consulting arrangement that was more generous than Marcus had expected, flexible hours that would allow him to maintain his taxi driving if needed, competitive pay that would significantly improve his financial situation, and the freedom to work on projects that aligned with his expertise. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened," she said quietly. "I'm asking you to help me build something better." When Marcus explained the situation to Tommy in simple terms, careful not to burden his son with adult complications, Tommy's response was immediate and decisive. "Will you be happy if you build airplanes again?" Tommy asked, his 6-year-old logic cutting through the emotional complexity with characteristic directness. Marcus nodded, realizing that he had been genuinely excited about the prospect of returning to engineering work. "Will I still get to be friends with Lucas?" Tommy continued, and Marcus said he thought that was likely. "Then you should do it," Tommy concluded with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his father's judgment. "Mama always said you should do things that make you happy if they don't hurt anybody else." Marcus called Victoria back that afternoon and accepted the consulting position, surprised by the relief he felt at making the decision. They agreed to start with a 3-month trial period, with the understanding that either party could withdraw if the arrangement proved uncomfortable or unproductive. Victoria sent a contract within hours, and Marcus spent the evening reviewing terms that were more favorable than anything he had expected. The work would begin the following Monday, and for the first time in 2 years, Marcus felt like he was moving forward rather than simply surviving. The first month of Marcus's consulting work exceeded his expectations in almost every way. Victoria kept her word about giving him creative freedom and direct access to resources, and the engineering team welcomed him with genuine enthusiasm rather than the suspicion he had feared. His first project involved reviewing safety protocols for a new passenger aircraft design, and he found himself working with cutting-edge technology that made his previous work seem primitive by comparison. Victoria treated him as an equal collaborator rather than a subordinate, seeking his input on major decisions and defending his recommendations when other executives questioned the cost of implementation. The boys' friendship flourished alongside their professional collaboration. Lucas and Tommy spent weekends together, alternating between Marcus's modest apartment and Victoria's sprawling house in the suburbs. The contrast between their living situations was stark, but both children seemed to thrive in both environments. Lucas brought an extensive collection of building blocks and educational games to the apartment, while Tommy introduced Lucas to simple pleasures like ice cream trucks and neighborhood cats. Victoria seemed to recognize that despite the expensive furnishings and professional landscaping, her house felt lonely in ways Marcus's small apartment never had. 3 months into the consulting arrangement, Victoria asked Marcus to join her for dinner at an upscale restaurant to discuss making their professional relationship permanent. The setting was elegant but not ostentatious, chosen with careful consideration for both their comfort levels. "I want to offer you a full-time position," she said without preamble, once they had ordered their meals. "Chief of Safety Innovation, reporting directly to me. You'd have your own team, your own budget, and complete autonomy over safety research and development." Marcus felt his pulse quicken at the offer, but he forced himself to consider it carefully rather than responding with immediate enthusiasm. "Why?" he asked, genuinely curious about her motivations. Victoria smiled, looking more relaxed than he had ever seen her, her business attire replaced by a simple dress that made her seem more approachable. "Because I want to build a company that my son can be proud of," she said simply. "A company that prioritizes innovation and safety over short-term profits. I can't do that alone, and I've learned that the best way to attract talented people is to give them meaningful work and the resources to excel at it." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "Also, because I trust you. Trust is rare in business, and I've learned not to take it for granted." The partnership was tested when Marcus discovered a significant safety flaw in Sterling Aviation's older aircraft models, a design defect that could potentially cause catastrophic failure under specific atmospheric conditions. The discovery came during a routine review of maintenance records, and Marcus's analysis revealed that the flaw affected nearly 30% of the company's active fleet. Victoria's response exceeded his expectations, demonstrating a commitment to safety that he had never seen during his previous employment. She immediately grounded the affected aircraft and initiated a comprehensive safety review, despite the fact that the decision would cost millions in lost revenue and require extensive negotiations with airline customers. "This is exactly why I hired you," Victoria told Marcus during the crisis. "I needed someone who would tell me the truth, even when the truth was expensive." 6 months into his new position, Marcus realized he was genuinely happy with his life for the first time since Sarah's death. The work was challenging and meaningful. His relationship with Tommy had strengthened as his own emotional health improved, and he had developed a circle of colleagues who respected his expertise and enjoyed his company. One evening, as they were reviewing safety reports in Victoria's office, she looked up from her paperwork and said quietly, "I've been thinking about us, about what we've built together, both professionally and personally." Marcus felt his chest tighten with nervous anticipation, unsure where the conversation was heading. "I care about you," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than I probably should, given our history. We've become a family of sorts, the 4 of us." They talked until late that evening, exploring the complexities of their situation with the same careful attention they brought to engineering problems. Marcus acknowledged his growing feelings for Victoria while honoring his grief for Sarah, explaining that love didn't diminish with time, but could expand to include new people and experiences. Victoria accepted responsibility for her role in his suffering, while asserting her right to pursue present happiness, recognizing that guilt and regret were poor foundations for future decisions. They hadn't resolved everything, but they had established a foundation for moving forward together, built on honesty, mutual respect, and shared commitment to their children's well-being. The decision to become romantically involved was made gradually, through small gestures rather than dramatic declarations. They began spending more time together outside work, sharing dinners and weekend activities with both children, slowly building intimacy alongside their professional partnership. Lucas and Tommy were delighted by the increasing closeness between their parents, having apparently hoped for exactly this development from the beginning. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and Marcus found himself imagining a future that included all four of them, a blended family built on love and mutual respect rather than mere convenience. A year after accepting the chief position, Marcus spoke at the International Aerospace Safety Conference about Sterling Aviation's innovative approaches to risk management. The presentation was well received, and several industry leaders approached him afterward to discuss potential collaborations. Victoria attended the conference and listened from the back of the auditorium, her face glowing with pride as Marcus fielded questions from colleagues who clearly respected his expertise. Afterward, she told him how proud she was of his accomplishments, how watching him rebuild his career had been one of the most inspiring experiences of her life. "You've become the kind of man I'm honored to love," she said, and it was the first time either had used the word love explicitly. That evening, they had dinner at the same restaurant where Victoria had originally offered him the full-time position, the circular nature of their journey not lost on either of them. The conversation flowed easily, covering everything from work challenges to the boys' latest adventures, the comfortable intimacy of two people who had learned to trust each other completely. As they were leaving the restaurant, Victoria stopped on the sidewalk and turned to face Marcus directly, her expression serious but not anxious. "I have something I want to ask you," she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small velvet box that made Marcus's heart skip a beat. "Marcus Williams, will you marry me?" She opened the box to reveal a simple gold band that was both elegant and practical, chosen with the same careful consideration she brought to all important decisions. Marcus looked at the ring, then at Victoria's face, then thought about Tommy and Lucas and the life they had built together over the past year. The proposal felt both surprising and inevitable, the natural culmination of a journey that had begun with a lost child and a moment of compassion. "Yes," he said simply, his voice steady despite the emotion in his chest, and Victoria's smile was brighter than any corporate achievement had ever made her look. They kissed there on the sidewalk, two people who had found their way to love through loss, forgiveness, and the recognition that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected circumstances. The wedding took place 6 months later in a small ceremony attended by family and close friends, held in the garden of Victoria's house with simple decorations that reflected both their personalities. Tommy served as Marcus's best man, wearing a miniature version of his father's suit and taking his responsibilities with touching seriousness. Lucas walked Victoria down the aisle, with the dignity of a 7-year-old who understood the importance of the moment, his small hand steady in hers as they approached the altar. In his wedding speech, Marcus thanked Victoria for showing him that loving someone new didn't diminish the love he had shared with Sarah. It just made his heart bigger, more capable of joy and connection. 3 years later, Marcus and Victoria had built both a successful marriage and a thriving business partnership. Sterling Aviation had become an industry leader in safety innovation, while Tommy and Lucas had grown up as brothers in every way that mattered, their friendship the foundation of their blended family. On quiet evenings, Marcus sometimes thought about that night at JFK, when he had first encountered Lucas crying alone in the terminal, wondering what might have happened if he had made a different choice, if he had let anger override compassion. That moment of decision, to help a frightened child despite his own pain, had set in motion events that completely transformed his life in ways he could never have imagined. The toy airplane that had started their connection still sat on Lucas's bookshelf, though it had been joined by dozens of models the boys had built together over the years. Sometimes Marcus would find Lucas holding it while he did homework, and he would remember that first night when a scared little boy had clutched it like a lifeline. Victoria often said their story proved that the most important journeys weren't about reaching a destination, but about finding the people you were meant to love along the way. Marcus agreed, though he would add that sometimes home wasn't a place you returned to, but a place you built with people who chose to stay through both difficult and beautiful moments.